But I think that we have to remember that all of the gospel writers come from a different place, a different perspective, let's say. And we hinted at this in our series, The Final Word, where we talked about that Scripture is inspired, but it wasn't inspired and written in such a way that it overpowered the individual voice of the author. And so when we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they really do give us in many ways four different perspectives on the life of Jesus.
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we take a deeper dive into Sunday's message and explore any questions you might have. I'm your host, AJ Stevens, joined by lead pastor Chip Parker, and I'm thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime member of the Orchard or a first-time visitor, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spirituality, and daily life, seeking to understand how the wisdom shared on Sundays can be applied to our modern challenges. So grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's dive in together. This is Let's Talk About That, where the conversation about Sunday's message never stops. We are back one more time in 2024.
It's kind of wild, isn't it?
It's been wild. It's been a journey. I'm looking over here at the episode number, and it's episode 54. So this is a full year of podcasts.
I know, it's kind of just crazy to think about doing it. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it. Yeah. It's a lot of fun to record, bringing on a bunch of different guests. It's good times. Like you and I were talking before we got started. Maybe next year we can kind of go back and look at some of the highlights of the podcast from the last year, episodes that got some traction. I'm not going to be shocked if those episodes were Momcast and Dadcast.
Yeah, well, that's the trend we've seen, right? Is like Momcast, Dadcast, and then people that shared stories. Those are their stories. Those are the three consistent things. And I think it's because it's like those are the most relatable, right? These are people, for us, I think, in many ways, though that's the pastor, you know what I mean? And kind of it's a little bit different for them. But then when you put somebody who's not the pastor in a chair and you say, hey, just tell me about what Jesus has done, I think there's a level of that for people that's a little more like, oh,
yeah,
so you can do it for them, he can do it for me,
Yeah, stories are powerful. Stories are powerful. I think it's a reminder that stories aren't final, because all of us, our stories still being written, things can go sideways. And a lot of ways when people share stories, they're very much subjective to their experience, but that doesn't make them any less powerful. When you hear them, that you're like, okay, wow, if God did that there, what can he do in my life? And I think that's important.
I think it's a good word. You said stories aren't final, until we're with Jesus, which is important because you look at somebody like David and you have this just roller coaster, and there's probably a season of your life or of his life where people are watching like, this guy's invincible and he could do no wrong. And they're like, oh my gosh, how do you ever come back from that? This guy couldn't do no right. And then you come back and you're like, oh man, he's got the favor of God again. So that's a good word. I think reminder that life is seasonal,
Yeah, for sure. We all have ups and downs and everything in between.
Yeah, that's good. Any ups and downs for you this year? Anything that you're like, man, this was a high, this was a low? Putting you on the spot there because we didn't talk about this, but is there anything that sticks out?
I'm sure that there were. I am not in a very reflective frame of mind yet. That usually happens, I guess, after Christmas when all the things were done. I would say that, we always find a way to talk about this, but in fantasy football,
come on,
the highs were, wait, did my team just sneak into the playoffs? And my low was losing to you last night in the semifinals by 9/10 of a point.
So we were talking about this last night.
9/10 of a point.
And for one, this is just, if you're a fantasy football guy or girl, you'll appreciate this part of the conversation. If you're Don Miller, you won't. But I don't think either of us halfway through the season we're like, oh, we're going to be staring at the playoffs this year.
Oh, yeah. I was like preparing for next year because I mortgaged my future to win the championship last year.
Yeah.
And so I had hardly any picks this year. And then I made trades at the trade deadline where I sold some of my good players and got future picks back. And then I was like, going on a run, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm in this thing. I don't know how I'm in this thing, but I'm in this thing. And then I made the playoffs, and then I'm like, oh, I think I've got AJ beat.
I thought you had me beat too.
And then I didn't.
We were talking about this.
And then I didn't.
I went to bed unintentionally the first time. I was sitting on the recliner and woke up with the computer in my lap. I was watching on the computer. And
phenomenal. Does that mean you were bootlegging?
Maybe. Streamies.live, but one of those links doesn't work because it's already been seized by the government. Anyway, I was watching, and I went to bed coming to grips with the fact that you'd beat me. It was third quarter. You needed 1 point out of their main running back, and I was like, "Oh, Chip's got me. I'm going to bed because I can't stand this misery." And so I went to bed, and I woke up, and when I had woke up from my little cat nap on the recliner, the little slider said, "Oh, you've been beat." And I didn't know what time it was because I was kind of delirious. So I just opened the app, saw that you were completely green. I was completely red.
I was ahead of you in points at that point, actually.
Yeah, and I had nobody left.
Yeah.
So I'm cooked. Chip wins. Go to bed, officially move from the recliner to my actual bed. And then I wake up at 3:45 a.m., I think is what it was, just by happenstance. And when I wake up, I struggle to go back to sleep. So I'm up at least for a couple hours. And so I'm up and I'm going through notifications that I missed during my napping period on the recliner. And I saw a text from you and said, praying for a stat correction. And I was like, why? He had me whooped. And so, and I think my Enneagram 7-ness didn't even want to go open the app when I woke up. So I didn't even look at it because I just knew I was beat. And so when I saw your text, I was like, what is he talking about? So I opened it up and saw that you had, that I beat you somehow. And I was like, what
by
the heck
9/10 of a point.
Yeah. And so I didn't know what happened. I just knew that in between the sleep depravity and everything else that I was already beat. And then I woke up and I was a winner. And it was, look at that. It's great.
Well, I know that people do not care to hear the details of it, but let's just say it's another reason for me to hate the Cowboys. So
tell us why.
Well, because it's my defense that lost 3 points they had scored because they gave up an extra field goal and then dropped an interception at the end that would have won it for me. Anyway, they were skilled different ways, but it's fine. Know, as I'm told all the time, it's not even a real sport. Yes, it is. It's a real sport with real players. The games that we play just aren't real.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Fantasy advice for anybody heading into the playoffs: pick any defense that's streaming against the Giants. If the defense playing against the Giants is available, grab them. It doesn't matter who it is.
No joke.
Oh, man. All right, so with Christmas coming, there's some seasonal markers, right? Fantasy football is coming to an end. That means Christmas is about here. And I love that we kind of have this gentleman's agreement this time of year. I think usually, not everybody does this, but in years past with Lance and with you, and I think even with Shane Edge at one point, we kind of just hey, Christmas is coming. If we split the pot now, we don't have to wait till after Christmas, and you can use that money for Christmas gifts, whatever. So it's always kind of a little marker.
Well, it's always for you. I don't know that any of the rest of us have ever split the pot. It's just really? AJ. Yeah, not like anybody else ever has.
Well, it was offered up to me the first year I won by Lance, and so I just
so he offered it.
Yeah, so I just assumed it was a thing people did. Yeah. So it's great. Anyway, well, if you want to split the pot, let's split the pot. If you don't, no.
Well, now that I'm bounced out of the playoffs, Christmas is a little smaller at the Parker. No, I'm just kidding. We already had all the gifts bought. Finally, thankfully.
Tell Jason I'm sorry. But Christmas is coming. So, do you guys have any big plans?
I mean, yeah, no, kind of. Christmas with the family. Going over to Mexico Beach to hang out with my dad for a little bit. Then after Christmas, in between Christmas and New Year's, we always go on a hunting trip with him, taking the boys. So that's always fun. But I enjoy the downtime around Christmas. So that's nice. So
that's the gift.
Not a ton of big plans. No.
Rest. Okay. Good. Well, it's highly likely we won't have an episode between now and New Year's because everybody's going to be, like you said, kind of out and doing all that kind of stuff. So
we'll catch you in 2025.
Yeah, we will. But with that said, do you have any, because it's one of the big things around New Year's is New Year's resolutions, right? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set out to lose 40 pounds, or shout out Trey Lee, or I'm going to start reading my Bible, or I'm going to go on a fitness journey, whatever it is, right? Do you have any New Year's resolutions lined up for Chip?
So
Chip's family?
I stopped New Year's resolutions a while back, just because they tend to fail, which doesn't mean I don't have goals. I set goals often, but resolutions, no. Pastor Eddie actually is the one who introduced me to the idea of a lot of times he chooses a word for the year.
Yeah.
That he just kind of wants to be the theme of the year, what he wants to focus on. Maybe it's peace, maybe it's productivity, maybe it's family, whatever. But I like the word approach, but yeah, I haven't done New Year's resolutions in a minute.
So how does the word approach work? So if I pick the word peace, what is it? Everything I do, I'm trying to filter through the lens of how does this bring peace, or?
Yeah, just kind of the theme, the focus for the year. It's not like a check mark, achieve it, but that's what I want to, bring a lot of my focus and priority to.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Fun fact, if you do New Year's resolutions and you fail them every year, you're not alone. 80% of New Year's resolutions fail by February?
I think that's kind of why I quit.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like, they fail so fast.
Yeah.
So fast.
Just kind of setting yourself up for failure in many ways.
Which, I think that goes to something, you alluded to this in your message Sunday, but one of the things that we say at the Orchard is, don't overestimate what you can accomplish in a year. Don't underestimate what you can accomplish in 5.
Yeah.
I think with New Year's resolutions, that same thing is at play. Like, you get by the middle of January and you're like, God, I've not even lost 50 pounds yet. How am I going to, or I've only read 16 books. So there's no way I'm going to finish my list, and you get so discouraged because you're not as far along as you thought you would be, and it's harder than you thought it would be. And so you just give up early because you don't see it happening. So that's why I think, the word approach is just kind of like, man, I'm just going to focus on this through the course of the year and see where it takes me.
Yeah, that saying is so good. And it's such it can be such a double-edged sword, right? Because when you think about what you can accomplish in a year, and then you think about what you can accomplish in 5 years, and you think about this idea of complacency or neglect, right? Neglect for a year, maybe not a big deal. Neglect for 5 years can be a very big deal. And I don't know, I think it's like a double-edged sword. It could happen on both sides of the coin. When you're diligent, it's great. When you're complacent, it could be devastating.
Well, I think the point of it is people get complacent because it doesn't happen as fast as they want.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wind up going nowhere because they're not going there fast.
Yeah.
When the point is, don't worry about getting there fast. Just get there, and you're going to, be further down the road. And so I think that's the thing. Like, are you going to sit and complain where you're at that you can't do what you want to do as fast as you can? Or are you going to do it slowly, but just get it done?
Yeah. I think back to, pictures I see of myself 5 years ago. And I'm like, wow, who's that skinny faced fella that got complacent over the last 5 years? It's tough, So I think that's a good word, though. Setting a word maybe is something worth entertaining because it's
interesting. It takes the pressure off of the resolution, maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Speaking of things that you have accomplished in a year, as you look back on, I want to take a second to do this because we don't at our locations. You get a chance to see a glimpse of this, but on this platform, everybody gets a chance to listen, right, to the same thing, and so. When you look back on 2024, I know you have some stats that you had shared at one point. What are some of those things that we were able to accomplish in the year of 2024 as a church, the Orchard?
Well, I think in this year, there were a lot of things that I feel like kind of fell into place and clicked. We really took a step forward in our communities, being a part of our communities, impacting our communities through service and relationships. We saw multiple baptisms at each of our locations, kids camp, student camps, bowl, jingle jam at 3 locations, just so much happening. And really maybe one of the most important things that happened this year is there was a lot of groundwork laid for the future, especially when we talk about that lasting impact and impacting tomorrow as we seek to grow up here at the Orchard and expand to thinking through what legacy are we going to be leaving? How are we impacting future generations, not just what does next year hold for us? And so there was a good bit of foundation that was laid. The stats that you mentioned that I pulled together this year weren't all just from this year. It was actually from the past 17 years at the Orchard. And just to kind of remind everybody of what those were, because, first 17 years, that's like our childhood, our adolescent years. This year, it's 18 years, and we're going to be an adult. So over the past 17 years, we've seen over 8,500 people walk through one of the doors of our locations or events. That's not just ministerially speaking. That's over 8,500 names that we have in a database for people who have registered for those things. We've seen over 400 people baptized. And that's a conservative over 400 people baptized. That number probably pushes closer to 5, but we don't have complete records on some things. So over 400 people baptized. We've had over $3.2 million that have been invested directly into impacting lostness. That's not how much money we've taken in offerings through the last 17 years. That is money that has been directly given to impact lostness. And that includes, but it's not limited to, over 30 different mission organizations that we've partnered with locally, nationally, globally. We have seen 9 different churches or locations that have been planted. So churches that exist that did not exist before the Orchard began. And then 8 partnerships that were established to help existing churches with revitalization efforts. And so 9 plus 8, if my math checks out, that's 17. That's one a year, right? And so all of that is just absolutely incredible about what we have seen the Lord do over the past 17 years at the Orchard. And I feel like that just continued this past year. Plus, we laid the groundwork for what the next 18 years are going to look like. And so that excites me. That fires me up.
Yeah, I think it's so true. It's one of the things I said Sunday is, I think we have, as a church, started to take on the identity of, hey, this is a church we can trust. This is a church we can lean on. This is a church that's going to meet needs when there's needs that they know about, all that kind of stuff. So just neat.
One of the questions that Pastor Eddie latched onto when he planted the Orchard was the question, if your church shut down tomorrow, would it be missed? And that's not by the people who attend there. Obviously, they would miss it. But if your church were to shut its doors, would the people who don't attend there miss it? Would the community miss it? Would those in need and on the margins miss it? Would the lost miss it? I think for the Orchard, I think the answer is a pretty clear yes at all 3 of our locations. Yeah. And that really, really does excite me. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about this Sunday because we announced at all 3 locations, and we have been. This is not the first time we announced it, but that we're not having church next Sunday on the 29th. It's just, we don't have many traditions at the Orchard. This is one of the ones that we have. From jump, Pastor Eddie said we're going to take the Sunday after Christmas off as a way to just kind of let our volunteers have a day to rest and go to church with, like you said, Sunday, your mom and them, go with all those guys. Because it takes so many volunteers to do what we do across 3 locations who are super faithful, and just say, hey, take a Sunday, be with your family. It's not don't go to church, just we're not having church.
Yeah.
And every year, I'm sure even before I came, we get questions, about that. Not mean-spirited, sometimes mean-spirited, but usually not mean-spirited. But man, it just hit me like us taking a Sunday off from having a worship service does not make us any less the church.
Yeah.
And if you like, well, I can't believe a church would ever not have Sunday services. They're the church. No, that's a worship service.
Yeah.
The Orchard still exists, and we are so much more than a Sunday service that if we don't have Sunday service this week, it's okay. And it's not a decision that we take lightly, but it's okay because our church is more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's good. It's true. So with everything that we have accomplished, and you kind of alluded to, all right, in the Vision series, time to grow up, and this is us moving out of adolescence in a way into adulthood. What is something you want to see us accomplish here in 2025?
Well, one of the big things we're going to be focusing on in 2025 is rolling out our Impact Tomorrow, focus, a strategy, an initiative, whatever you want to call it. That is what it's going to do is help break down to the level of the individual attender. What can I do to help the Orchard have a lasting impact on lostness in North Central Florida? And through that initiative, part of it is going to be what does your next step look like serving? What does your next step look like in your spiritual formation? What does your next step look like in giving? We're going to try to cast a vision for what you can help us accomplish through taking your next step. And really, as we push that out there, hopefully create a lot of buy-in from the people who call the Orchard home or want to call the Orchard home to say, hey, God has done so much the last 17 years. There are so many amazing people that call the Orchard home. What does it look like when we all start pulling in the same direction intentionally? Man, I believe the impact, no pun intended, the impact of that is going to be just more than we can wrap our head around. And so I'm really excited for next year to see us kind of roll that vision initiative out there and maybe create a lot of buy-in amongst people who've been like, yeah, I get the church wants to impact lostness, yada, yada. Not sure what that means for me. And break that down to an individual level so they can say, okay, here's my part. I'm in. Let's do this.
Yeah. The church really becomes a juggernaut when the individuals buy in, right? Like, I think that's when you start to see this stuff happen on like a big scale. So excited to see that too. Excited to see like,
I think, I wasn't planning on talking about this. I was still kind of thinking through it in my head, but if you guys know me, I like to think while I talk. One thing that's kind of been rolling around in my head is the need for us to see ourselves less as a, quote, church. And when I say that, I'm thinking like institutional church, religious experts, purveyor of spiritual goods, holder of worship services. I think we need to stop seeing ourselves as a, quote, church and see ourselves as a missions organization.
Okay.
Because that's who we are. If we see ourselves just as a church, everything revolves around the staff and that Sunday morning experience, right? Like, it's all about gather, come, attend. But that is never going to have the impact that we truly want it to have, because unchurched people don't come to church.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, that's why they're unchurched.
Right.
They're not looking to go to church. If you have the most awesome church in town, doesn't move their needle at all, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the shift has to be when we see ourselves as a missions organization, then the focus becomes who we are, not just when we gather, but when we scatter.
Mm-hmm.
When we are at the ball fields, in our schools, at our jobs, at dinner with friends, we are just as much the church then. And how do we train and equip our people to live as those informal missionaries that we've been talking about? And then when we see locations, it's not just, oh, we're going to be holding services now in this community. Well, why are we having a church in that community? There's churches, you can go to a service, at 15 different churches, or why can't they just drive here? What we see is, no, that's not just a new location. That's a mission outpost in that community.
Yeah,
that is an expression of a gospel community in that community. And so we start seeing it as mission outposts, not locations. We start seeing it as, informal missionary centric, not staff centric, and not centered around when we gather, but centered around when we scatter. And that is not to downplay the importance of services and, staff. We still live in the buckle of the Bible Belt, right? But I do think as we start to shift the way that we see our church more as a missions organization than as an institutional church, maybe it changes the way we approach impacting lostness.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's really good. I like the idea of a mission outpost, right? This place where you can come get refueled, but then scatter. Like, this is not where you sit. This is not where you kind of become a glutton, so to speak. This is where you go fill up to pour back out. That's good. I like that a lot. So we have a lot of really cool stuff coming to 2025, but we also just finished up a series that I think was helpful in many ways with exactly what you're talking about, because this whole series has been geared around the idea, right, of moving from this childhood faith to, no, this is what it looks like for me to understand these things through the lens of adulthood. And here's the why, and here's what Jesus really wanted me to unpack with this entire story. And so we just got done wrapping up this series, Coloring Book Christmas, and I'm curious, there's so much that we did unpack, and there's so much that we could have unpacked. But what are some of those things, and maybe that's the question, what are some of those things that you're like, man, I wish we could have got to this, or this would have been a fun extra piece to the equation, or there's so much here, but if we would have dove into it, we'd have been an hour in service, not just 30 minutes, stuff like that.
Man, there's a ton of that we could have gotten into. I think that one of the things that we didn't do is check out the Christmas story from John's writings, Now, you and I hit on this in the podcast, that in Revelation, John mentions the Christmas story when, the dragon is about to devour the child of the woman who's giving birth, whatever. But I'm talking about even in John's gospel, he shares the Christmas story. We don't think of John as sharing the Christmas story because, John begins chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And yet, when you read verse 14, it's the Christmas story. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us, And we observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You know, that's the Christmas story, that the Word was made flesh and it dwelt among us. And so, I mean, that's one thing. One of my most memorable Christmas messages I ever preached was, something along the lines was, Christmas was a missions trip, because it was when Jesus, came to live among us and bring the gospel to us. But really, I think maybe for our time today, I could share what I kind of was looking through and thinking through just from a personal level as we went through this series.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like necessarily application wise. I just mean personally studying and looking at. And that is the differences between Matthew and Luke's Christmas story.
Okay.
Right? So let's just start here. When we talked in this series, you have Matthew, who tells the story of Herod and the wise men. And you have Luke, who shares the story of the shepherds, and you're like, well, why didn't both include both? They seem like significant parts of the story.
Right.
But I think that we have to remember that all of the gospel writers come from a different place, a different perspective, let's say. And we hinted at this in our series, The Final Word, where we talked about that Scripture is inspired, but it wasn't inspired and written in such a way that it overpowered the individual voice of the author. And so when we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they really do give us in many ways four different perspectives on the life of Jesus. John's Gospel. John's Gospel is entirely unique from the other three. It includes things in the life of Jesus that the other three Gospels don't use. And John is very much written to convince readers of the divine nature of Jesus. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is John's gospel is written in many ways like a narrative of secular culture during that time that was written to praise a, warrior, an emperor, whatever, and talk about how awesome they were. Well, that's kind of John's gospel, written to talk about the divine nature of Jesus. And then you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are referred to as the synoptic gospels. Now, I know you studied this, in school because you were an apologetics major, but those three gospels share a lot of the same material, but they still come from a little bit of a different perspective. For instance, Mark's gospel is most likely the earliest gospel, and it's written kind of like, I don't know, an action movie. Mark is the movie gospel, because if you look, in Mark's gospel, I guess depending on which translation you use, the word immediately pops up a lot, and it doesn't mean like this happened 30 seconds later. It's just, shifting scenes.
Yeah. Boom, scene switch. Boom, scene
That's
switch.
right.
Boom, scene switch.
It's a scene cut. And Mark's gospel is written from Peter's perspective. We believe that Peter was the one sharing a lot of this with Mark as he wrote it down. And so it's an interesting gospel, but it's really short. Matthew and Luke are fuller accounts that you can tell were written intending to be passed on and preserved, but they were written to two vastly different audiences. You have Matthew that was written to a primarily Jewish audience, and then Luke's gospel that was written to a man named Theophilus, which is not a Jewish name, it's a Greek name. And maybe it was his real name, maybe it wasn't. Theophilus just means God, lover of God. Maybe it was a code name for somebody who, didn't want to be outed as a Christian. We're not sure. But it was written through more of a Gentile's perspective, or written with more of a Gentile reader in mind. And when you look at all of those differences, I think it explains some of the differences in the Christmas stories.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you get to this piece of the equation where Matthew's like, hey, I really want to lean in and focus in, and I really want to lock in, hey, Jewish audience, here's what I need you to understand about the divinity of Jesus as he shows up, King of the Jews, right? And I think Luke, on the other side of that coin, and this is what I think is so fascinating about Luke, he's a very intelligent individual too. And so he's not sparing details within the narrative. He's just like, man,
Dr. Luke.
yeah, this is what I need you to know. I'm not going to spare you details. Here's why it's important. And that's where, man, I think it lends to the credibility in the equation. It also lends to, for the audience that's kind of searching and seeking, I think this is one of the Gospels I'll point those people to. Hey, Luke is pretty detailed. Luke doesn't leave out a lot of those pieces of the equation, and Luke is more so written to you than it is, the guy living in the Middle East who's trying to be convinced this is who Jesus is.
Yeah, I think you see that even from the introductions, right? Luke's gospel begins, many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. So it seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you've been instructed. So 100% what you said. Hey, this is a very detailed account that I've researched to convince you, a skeptic, a new believer, not a lot of background. Switch over to Matthew's gospel, right? Mm-hmm. An account, Matthew 1:1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
And this mattered to them, right? This mattered to the Jewish
audience. This is a Jewish audience. And then he goes through the lineage from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to Jesus, to trace that. And then he brings in the story of King Herod. Right?
Yeah.
King Herod, the enemy of the Jews, the false king. And Matthew begins contrasting him to this new king, not a king who would kill the innocents to preserve his throne, but a king who would die for the guilty, though he was innocent.
This is one of my favorite subtle undertones in the Christmas story. The comparison between King Herod and King Jesus. And this week, I think, really brings that out, maybe in a way that, you see it there when you read through the story of Herod, but I think when you get to the wise men, it really does bring those undertones out, because they're showing up, and we talked about this week, but when you see the way that they're just immediately in adoration and worship mode, you get a glimpse of, like, this king he's done nothing yet to deserve this by way of how we would normally treat somebody, or this idea that, like, there's give and take in the world. Yet they're fully convinced this king is about to do everything, right?
Yeah.
This king is about to take the throne.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, which is actually another part of the differences that I just find so interesting in Matthew and Luke, right? So Matthew is written to a primary Jewish audience. Luke is written to a primary Gentile audience. And yet, look at who visits Jesus, in the birth narrative. In Matthew's gospel, written to a Jewish audience, it's the Magi. The Magi are not Jewish.
Yeah.
These are Gentile. Why? These are Gentile astronomers from Babylon. And so Matthew makes a point to say, though this is the king of the Jews, like you said, AJ, these foreigners, these Gentiles have come to worship him because he's so much more than that. And in Luke's gospel, written to the Gentiles, the shepherds come to worship him. And who are the shepherds? Well, the shepherds were good, everyday Jewish boys who served in the temple fields, raising the temple sheep.
Yeah, the sacrifices.
Right.
The would-be sacrifices.
And so he immediately ties it back to Judaism and the roots of Judaism and the temple sacrifices. And so I think that's interesting that the Gentile Christmas story has Jewish visitors and the Jewish Christmas story has Gentile visitors. I think it's interesting to me.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, but it's almost necessary in a way. Like there's this harmony. Is harmonious a word? There's this harmonious.
It is. I'm not sure that's the place to use it, but it's definitely a word.
There's this harmonious piece where you see the tie-in, right? Because you need both, and that's what's so important when we talk about reading our Bible through a Western lens, right? We do that all the time, yet I think the picture becomes a little more clear when we put the Eastern glasses on and we try to understand it in a way. And I think so I say it's similar to how Luke invites his audience in, but shows them, no, look, like I need you to understand what's going on here so that you can understand what's going on here in a way to those Gentiles. So I think it's just fascinating to me that you have both. You have seemingly the opposite piece that you would guess is in the equation, yet it's necessary to what the author is bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think, it's fascinating. And you talked about, it was harmonious.
That's what I did.
What popped into my mind is, and this is the nerd in me, George Lucas, the guy who, directed Star Wars. I remember, a quote from him about Star Wars, the original trilogy and then the prequel trilogy that, you saw first, AJ, with the cooler lightsaber fights and droids and all that.
Yeah.
George Lucas said this about Star Wars. He said, it's like poetry, it rhymes, right? It's not the same story, but there's those echoes, right? It rhymes. And I think Lucas hit on something that God hit on because he installed it in us way, way before. And that is that there are some of those echoes that do resonate within us all throughout Scripture. It rhymes. It parallels. And when you see that happen over and over again, you begin to realize, wow, this isn't just any book. This is a supernatural book because, George Lucas did it. And then he has, a legion of fans who have ripped it apart because it doesn't rhyme or it missed this or that. And then you have this book that has been around for thousands of years, that has been, put through the ringer by every opponent imaginable, and yet it stands.
Yeah, and you mentioned this. I was an apologetics major. And this is the piece of Scripture that maybe intrigues me the most. And I said this Sunday for a different reason, but I think it applies here. One of our favorite things to say is it just so happens never just happens. And it rhymes. Like from front cover to the back cover, it just so happens never just happens. And you see this story that's intertwined and it's consistent and it speaks to other pieces. And there's a key that unlocks it that you need from one piece. And so that's one of the things that's most fascinating to me about the story. And it just so happens never just happens.
So it's been a hot minute since we've had one of these, AJ.
A nerd out section?
I think it's time for a nerd out section.
All right.
So this is probably the coolest thing that I have found studying this, because you're talking about echoes. You're talking about how it rhymes. There is a clear echo in Luke's gospel that I think we have, for the most part, missed. Not everybody has missed, because the more I studied it, people have written on it, preached on it. Sure. I'll just say I had missed until I found it, and it was
I'm on the edge of my seat.
It was pretty awesome. So in Luke's gospel, did it ever seem weird to you that the birth of John the Baptist was given more detail and attention than the birth of Jesus?
Yeah, it is interesting. That seems to be like a necessary piece to the equation we just kind of blow past.
It is. And I think, we don't necessarily blow past it because, it's not important or whatever. It's just, I think we don't fully understand it. We acknowledge that it's important because he's a forerunner of Jesus. But what I think we miss is the echo, because here's what I found. John the Baptist is an echo of Samuel, the priest, the prophet Samuel. So if you go and look at it, it's actually pretty incredible. So I'm gonna throw some things at you that I think are just interesting. When you look at Samuel and John the Baptist, the echo is super clear. So both of them were from the tribe of Levi, right? Samuel and John the Baptist. Both of them had a mother who was barren. Hannah was barren. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2. And then Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, verse 7 was barren. They both went to the house of God in their barrenness and cried out to the Lord. Hannah did that in Samuel, and you have, John the Baptist father, Zechariah, do that for his wife. You see that this child is going to be given back to God when it's born. It's going to be set aside. Many believe that both of them took the Nazirite vow, which was a special vow that you could take, that it was a birth that was, foretold or promised to Hannah and Elizabeth. The names of Samuel and John are both names based on God. You know, Samuel means I asked of God, or it means God hears. John means that God has been gracious. You know, so it's that idea, hey, God heard, God answered our prayer. You see in both accounts that praises were offered by the parents when the child was born. Both of these children become prophets. And then, are you ready for this?
On the edge of my seat again.
Both of them are the one who anoints the true king of Israel. Samuel goes to Jesse's house and anoints David as the true king of Israel, even though it's going to be years before he actually assumes the throne in full.
Yeah.
And at the baptism of Jesus, we see John the Baptist anoint Jesus as the true king of Israel, even though we have not yet seen his kingdom come in its fullness.
That's pretty cool.
It's echoes.
Yeah.
It's echoes.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. It's man, it just so happens, never just happens.
Yeah.
Right.
It's almost like one God wrote this whole book.
Right. And that is like, when you sit back and you look at it, it's that woven throughout Scripture, and then it's also woven throughout creation, man. Like, and this is one of the little subtle details that I mentioned in Sunday that's really not so subtle when you think about it. Like, if this is going to happen and God's going to lay out the timeline this way, like something as simple as light travels at X amount of speed. And so if that star is going to be there at the right time, God had to appoint that before the moment needed to happen, right? And so it's the consistency. It's him interweaving Scripture together. The echoes there. It's creation order being the thing that kind of. Adam, right? Like it's creation and it's Scripture. Jesus is the new Adam, the better Adam, the Adam that redeems, not the Adam that breaks. And so I don't know. As you sit back and you process and you start to fully understand Scripture, which is why we stress this so much, and we want people to dive in. We want people to learn. There's, I think, a moment that comes where you're like, how could this not be, right? Like, how could I be unconvinced that this is not something somebody else beside myself and greater than myself is orchestrating and knitting together?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that it takes time to see a lot of this stuff. It's kind of like, this is going to sound so stupid. It's kind of like,
I'm on the edge of my seat.
It's kind of like Disney movies and SpongeBob.
Okay.
When you watch them as a kid, it's just a Disney movie and it's SpongeBob. When you watch them as an adult, you see, hey, those guys threw some stuff in there for adults.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure.
Stuff that you don't pick up on as a child, but you just get a little bit later as an adult. Well, I think that's true of Scripture as well, that there are some things in Scripture that as an unbeliever or even as a new believer, you're just not going to pick up on. But as you spend years being formed spiritually by this book, you do begin to see more and more, and you're like, oh, I see what you were doing there. I see what happened right there. Yeah. And I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think it's one of those things that it builds, it's time over time. It's not just, I got a commentary, I read the Bible, I don't see any of this stuff.
Right.
It takes time.
Which I think is fine and good and maybe even necessary in some ways, because as I reflect back on, and maybe you can speak to this too, my own faith journey, I didn't need any extra nuggets because of how long I sat in this idea that, oh gosh, grace and Jesus is for me. Like, I didn't need to move past that for a while. You know what I mean? I needed to sit with that for a while before I went nugget hunting and started to look in Scripture and see how much other things were there. And here's the beauty of it. When those other things kind of come along down the road, all it does is affirm and sure up and point back to, oh, Jesus and grace and all this stuff. So not a bad thing. Sit with that for a while, especially if you're early in your faith journey. But there should be a moment, right, where we graduate a little bit and we move from milk to meat, per se. And
I think you said something that I want to go back to so we don't go over. You talked about, in your faith journey. Here's one thing that I've learned. People don't come to faith because their questions get answered.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that there's not an intellectual piece to our faith. We've talked about that on the podcast, that there are certain things that you have to know, that you have to believe. There is a propositional truth that is the foundation of what we believe. And yet, I don't know that I've met anyone, maybe one or two, I don't think so, who have stayed away from trusting Jesus because of concerns about the validity of those propositional truths.
Yeah, sure.
You don't come to faith when your questions get answered. You come to faith when your faith becomes bigger than those questions.
Yeah.
When you believe. That's what John says at the end of his gospel. I've written these things so that you might believe, and believing have life in his name.
Yeah.
So it's like, no, the whole point of this isn't to convince you of its historicity, even though it can be done. But you're not going to come to faith when you're convinced of its historicity. You're going to come to faith when you believe. And so I think that that's just such a big deal for me. And I think the reason it's a big deal for me is it informs how we talk to unbelievers.
Yeah.
It gives us permission not to have to win every argument.
Yeah.
Because nobody's going to come to faith because you won an argument. You made a better argument and they did, oh, you proved me wrong. I guess I'll get saved now, that it's a supernatural work whereby we are made alive through the Spirit and we believe.
Yeah.
And I think that's just an important piece for me, is all of these things are true, but they're supernatural.
Yeah.
And you're going to see them as you see them. And it's not, well, let me answer everybody's questions and then the world's going to get saved. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the other pieces to the wise men equation that I love from this Sunday, and the tie-in to the age-old truth. Like, if you'll just you don't need all the questions answered. Just go pursue God. Go run after him and ask him to reveal himself. And I don't think he's going to withhold himself from you, right?
No.
I don't think he's dying for you to be missing pieces of the puzzle so that you can go suffer for eternity forever.
Yeah, I think, I want to add a little bit of nuance to that, because I completely agree that when we seek after God, he promises that that he will be found by us, right? That you said when we cry out to him, his arm is not so short that he's not going to hear an answer. But I think that sometimes we fool ourselves into think that we're searching after God. When we're not searching after God, we're demanding he present himself.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think at that case, I don't know that I would be expecting God to show up to your summons.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's not a genie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and so I think there's a fine line there.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that your heart's in the place that you are genuinely pursuing him in humility and sincerity.
Yeah.
Not in pride and arrogance.
Yeah, which is one of the... I feel like I mentioned maybe this prayer from David more than any other prayer, but it's the reason David says, search me, reveal to me the issues that I have that I don't even see that I have, right? Because I want to approach you the right way. I want to do this life. I want to pursue you the way that you deserve to be pursued, and I got so much AJ in here still that I know even when I don't think I'm in my own way, I'm in my own way. And I think that's really the heart that David's got, is like, I know I got so much David in here that I'm going to struggle even when I'm the most well-intended, even when I feel like I'm doing it right. I got too much of me in here and I want to get out of my own way. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. You underestimate your own pride in many ways.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else because I think what we've just done is we've opened up a can of worms that could beg a million other conversations.
That's what we do, though, right?
Yeah, about different pieces of scripture. But I would say, if there's anything in there that's intriguing to you, let us know. We'll be happy to get lunch or coffee or whatever and keep that conversation going.
I think, don't miss, guys, that this is a podcast, but we are under no illusions that we are viral celebrities. Like, we are still accessible for you to reach out to and ask questions and say, hey, could you guys talk more about that on the podcast?
Yeah.
We enjoy.
You meant to say that we are not viral celebrities.
What did I say?
We are viral celebrities.
I said we are under no illusions that we are.
Oh, okay. Got you.
I think that is what I intended to say.
We are not viral celebrities.
We do know that. Double click on that one more time. We are not viral celebrities.
Yes. With that said, let's keep the conversation going. Is there anything else that you have from the series or from the Christmas story that you're like, man, I just want to spend a second leaning into that?
No.
There doesn't have to be. I'm just throwing it out there.
I just think maybe one thing that we ought not lose in the specificities of all the things that we've talked about, all the specifics that we've talked about, is that this really happened to real people with real problems and real emotions. And that's because that's where God meets us every time.
It's a good word.
This is real, and we don't need to miss that.
Yeah, that's good. The same God that you see on the page of Scripture is the same God who's listening when you cry out to him.
That's right.
It's good stuff. Well, man, 2024, what a lot of fun. What a lot of fun getting to sit across the table from you Monday after Monday after Monday.
It's been a good time.
Let this thing drop on Tuesdays and get all the texts and the questions and all that kind of stuff.
It's been a good time. Been a good time. And look, hey, for the record, no FSU shade.
Yeah, not today.
Podcast.
You know, we left them out until 2025, you know.
Plenty of Tennessee shade. No FSU shade.
Oh, have you heard from him?
Not about that.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all we got for today. Man, we'll see you guys, or not see you guys, but we'll talk to you guys, I guess, in 2025. Hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll catch you there.
See you then.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow in this journey of faith and embrace community. If you have more questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website and stay connected. Your questions are what make this podcast a dynamic and enriching experience. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who may find value in these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you and will help you bring Sunday's message into your week ahead. Keep the conversation alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.